I forgot that quickly, didn't I? Hi, everyone. My name is Cydnee Sanders. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a recent graduate of Hamline. And today's topic, translanguaging as an anti-racist practice, was my master's research that I did. And then I am presenting with Betsy. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Betsy Parrish, she, her pronouns, and I feel privileged to be here today to work with Cydnee as she showcases the amazing work she did for her capstone project. I'm not in the classroom working with learners, but as a teacher educator here at Hamline, where I'm a professor, I've been weaving a lot of research and practices around translanguaging into the courses that I teach. To start off with, we want to find out who's here today. If you could take a moment to type your name, pronouns, what and where you teach, and what languages do you use in your daily life on a daily basis. If you could share that in the chat with us so we can all get to know each other a little bit, that would be great. And you could continue doing that as Cydnee moves us ahead as we share our objectives for today. So your name and where and what you teach and a language you use on a daily basis. So Cydnee.
And actually, while we do that, I'm going to start us off with a land and labor acknowledgement. I identify as a person of color. I am of mixed ancestry, including Native American and African. And so doing a land and labor acknowledgement is really important to me. So we wanted to start there.
Yeah.
So, land. The Twin Cities are located on the ancestral lands of the Dakota people. We acknowledge the Ojibwe, the Ho-Chunk, and the other nations of people who also called this place home. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. We also remember that many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, genocide, and colonization that influence to this day. We must acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice, and we must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generations and resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed today. We also acknowledge the continued exploitative labor practices used against people of color and immigrants. And again, this is just an acknowledgement, which I think is important to have, but I also want to emphasize that we can't just end there, check a box, right? Say we did this acknowledgement. I hope that this presentation talking about anti-racism in the classroom will really help push me and other people in our field to continue this work, especially because, you know, many of our learners are people of color and immigrants. And then second, I have some group agreements for us that I hope we can all listen to and agree to. First, listen respectfully to each person without interrupting. Y'all will go into some breakout rooms for 2 discussions today. And I think it's important to really listen and not try to talk over each other and interrupt and let people say what they need to say. But also understanding that if you're speaking a lot, step back when you need to. If you're not speaking a lot, you know, try to push yourself, have conversations. Second, speak for yourself and use I statements. We're talking from our own experiences. I am not speaking for my race or races for myself, right? So we're talking from my own experience. Do not correct others' experiences or try to fix someone's pain. I put this one in here, especially because as a person of color, and when I'm doing presentations like this, I typically share some vulnerable things that have racism that I have dealt with. And then a lot of responses are, oh, I'm sure they didn't mean that, or trying to find a solution. Sometimes I'm just telling you that this happened and you can't really fix it, but we can try to do better in the future, right? Number 4, keep conversations confidential, right? Take what you learn, but don't leave with specifics and tell other people. 5, expect discomfort and ambiguity. Issues will not be solved by the end of the workshop, right? Everyone always says we're not going to solve racism by the end of our 75 minutes, right? And that's okay, but we're going to keep trying, keep moving forward. 6, assume positive intent while accepting responsibility for your impact. Understanding there's a difference between you may have had good intentions, but as a person of color, for an example, I come with years of knowing that there's a history there of maybe your comment was actually hurtful to me, given the whole history of, my family's experience with racism, right? And so understanding that I will assume the best intent, but sometimes if I say, or another person says, ouch, right? We understand that there's a difference there. And 7, silence is okay. Let's normalize having a space to breathe and reflect. If you're in your conversations and there's silence, that's okay. Quite typically dominant white culture has us like speaking right one after another, interrupting each other, but some other cultures like Native American cultures maybe process things slower, or for other introverts, processing things slower and silence is okay. And then finally, have an open mind with the topics that we're discussing today. I know that's a lot, but I'm hoping that that can ground us in these agreements that we can agree to for today.
So our objectives for this afternoon are to articulate a working definition of anti-racism in the classroom. And we'll think about a variety of frameworks that we can draw on in order to serve adult learners more effectively, and also articulate a basic definition of translanguaging, and really importantly, to think about how that is an anti-racist practice. And finally, through a variety of examples that Cydnee is going to share, mostly I have a couple as well, but you're going to identify 2 or 3 translanguaging practices that you're committed to trying in your own classrooms. So our agenda on the right is some introductory, some background information, grounding frameworks, and we'll give you a chance to have two discussions, one thinking about translanguaging and your own beliefs about language and language teaching and learning with regard to use of and drawing on and leveraging learners L1s in the classroom and in their lives as learners of a language. And then you'll have a discussion to think about the practices you'd like to try. All right.
And then our last kind of grounding thing, I wanted to give a little bit more background of my motivation for this topic, which starts with a quote by Trevor Noah. If anyone doesn't know me, you would probably soon find out anyway that I love Trevor Noah. And his book was actually a really big inspiration for me when I started getting into teaching, which might sound unusual, but if you know much about his work, he's really good. Also, partially it's because that he is also Black and white like I am, and then mixed heritage, right? And then also he's so good at, he speaks multiple languages, and he has such a unique perspective of how multilingualism can work, which is why his book was a big inspiration to me. And in this book, he was kind of unpacking a famous quote by Nelson Mandela in this, but to paraphrase, then he says, when you make the effort to speak someone else's language, even if it's just basic phrases here and there, you are saying to them, I understand that you have a culture and an identity that exists beyond me. I see you as a human being. And to me, that is what is central about anti-racist teaching. Why I want to do this. In my family, we have lost numerous Native American and African languages because of the forced assimilation that my family had to go through. And when I chose to follow this, teaching English field, I was like, I don't want to perpetuate the same harm that my family experienced. So how can I bring people's culture and identities, make fully realizing them as a human being in our classrooms? And that's hopefully what we're going to talk about today. So to start our conversation today, I want to ground us in a couple of key terms. There's only a couple, so we can all start with the same foundation. Oh, sorry. But first in the chat, sorry, Betsy, actually.
That's okay. Well, we'd like you in the chat to write a word or a few words. What comes to mind when you hear the term anti-racist? So what comes to mind? And you go ahead and type that in the chat, and then I'll turn it back over. Cydnee's going to reflect a bit on what we see from you and make some connections to some of the frameworks that she's going to present.
Yeah, so what comes to mind when you hear anti-racist? And we'll give you a few seconds. All right, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. See if I can keep up with the chat here.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. Inclusive, active, being proactive, right? Purposeful inclusion, against racism. active efforts versus not passively being not racist. To not marginalize people. Acknowledging that racism is real, right? Which is still, you know, a topic for debate and a lot today, right? And that's something that we have to address and talk about for sure. Actively working. Rejecting the hierarchy of racism. All right, feel free to keep putting them in there, but we'll keep moving. But I'm assuming at this point, and based on y'all's answers, a lot of people are familiar with this, right? So I hope this is just a quick review of what anti-racism is. And if anyone doesn't know what it is, you know, also grounding for you. So I have these two terms here on the slide. And these two terms guided my master's capstone project. The title was Anti-Racist Practice, right? And so let's unpack those a little bit, but it's how I use these words as a researcher, but then also how I process racism as a person of color, right? So Kendi describes anti-racist as a policy or an idea that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. He says being racist or anti-racist is not a fixed identity, right? Anyone can be racist. And he gives many examples about how he, as a Black man, didn't realize something he thought, said, did, upheld some racist hierarchy. And I really like that because it includes me as a person of color to think about, okay, what am I doing that upholds racist hierarchies, right? And he says, it's not enough to be not racist or passive or neutral, but to be intentionally anti-racist. So we break down those hierarchies that racism creates. It's our job as teachers to see how hierarchies are perpetuated in our classrooms, whether it's in our curriculum or our expectations of student communication. And I think we should ask ourselves every day, where did I see, think, or do something that upholds a racial hierarchy? And then reflect on how to change that for the future, right? So be thinking, how does this definition connect to that you wrote in the chat, right? And from what I read, most people's right along this line. And then next, I really wanted to include the term praxis there, hoping that people are familiar, but maybe fewer are familiar with this word, but it was also central to my research. And if you don't know, the term praxis comes from, and I'm sorry, I do not know how to say his name correctly, but Paulo Freire's, his seminal work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he explains that praxis combines reflection and action. He emphasizes that both are critical, right? You cannot have only some reflection. And then that's where, in my experience, people tend to get stuck in the reflection. I want to read all the books, but then they don't ever get to the action part, right? And so he argues that we've really got to get to the action too, but we can't only have action. We need to think about what we're doing first, right? And so it's that endless circle, right? And so I encourage all of us to constantly think, reflect, and act, right? And I know we're still talking about these as big ideas, right? So it's hard to know, okay, what does anti-racism look like in the classroom? So we hope that we'll give some actual tangible examples in our next section. And because it's the name of our, one thing else I wanted to add, just acknowledging that making mistakes is part of the process. Like I said, a lot of people tend to get stuck in the, so afraid of making mistakes and causing it more harm that you never get past that, right? And so I really like that Kendi says to be anti-racist is to make mistakes, right? We can't be afraid of making mistakes because it's part of it. So we have to resist perfectionism and just try something, right? And then fix it, do better. Right. And I really like Maya Angelou's quote down at the bottom, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Right. That's what anti-racism is. We're going to make tons of mistakes, but then you have to keep trying. The other quote on the right by Bell Hooks says, we cannot be scared of making mistakes. Otherwise, this work, justice will never happen. Right. That's why it's worth it. That's why it's worth putting that risk out there, making mistakes, being vulnerable with people, and really trying to do this work.
So now we're going to turn to the theme of translanguaging within this framework of anti-racist practices. What comes to mind when you hear the term translanguaging? Before we define it for you, what comes to mind? Just write a few words in the chat. Let's see what we. Valuing first languages. Across languages. Code switching multiple languages, translating, respecting the languages of bilingual speakers and multilingual speakers. This is great. So Cydnee, how about if you take a few minutes to share with us what you've learned about translanguaging, and everybody can see how that connects with their thoughts here.
Yes. So before grad school, I had never heard of translanguaging. And I know it's a new way to think about languages for me. And I know I've heard from other people, it's a new idea too, though. Sounds like some people are familiar with it, right? But a lot of people's first question is like, we were taught, English only policies, that's the best way to learn English is to get rid of the other languages, just practice English, right? But a lot of recent research has exploring that why a multilingual approach to teaching English has more benefits for learners, right? And if you haven't read much on it, I encourage you to do so, but this will be the definition that we're working off of. And essentially, translanguaging, one of the leading scholars, her name's Ofelia García, this definition comes from her, and it essentially is saying translanguaging uses learners' full linguistic toolbox, right? Full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to socially and politically defined boundaries, of named and usually national and state languages, right? And so for me, the key parts about this definition is that it gets rid of racist hierarchies, just like we were talking about with Kindy's definition of anti-racism, right? So we're getting rid of the hierarchy between English and students' home languages, right? We're not worried about political boundaries of like, what is English, what is Spanish, right? Getting rid of all theory right now, and really just trying to think about this as one toolbox that learners can then pick and choose which languages, what words will suit them best in any given context, right? And so really giving learners more of that power to make those decisions for themselves. And then as English teachers, we're providing them specifically with those English tools. Oh, sorry. There we go. It's frozen a little bit. And again, hoping that this visual will help a little bit more, but the two most important things from Garcia's research that I've taken is that translanguaging sees learners' other languages as assets, right? Not something that inhibits the learning of English. And then second, translanguaging removes the language hierarchy that exists during the history of English teaching, right? Which has demanded throughout the history of English teaching that English is superior within our culture. English is superior to all other languages, right? That English is the only language needed for academic and career success. So again, other languages inhibit the learning of English, but translanguaging is saying the opposite, right? And this visual gives us that good look at that balance scale, right? Thinking of languages as one toolbox that are equal, and then students getting to decide for themselves which tool to use.
And I'm just going to add, when we think about our attitudes toward bilingual learners or multilingual learners, a vivid example from Nelson Flores's one of his articles is, why is it that we celebrate the white affluent kid who goes to a Chinese immersion class and we toot their horn and, oh, my kid is so great, they're learning 2 languages, and yet we don't speak about English learners in our schools that way oftentimes. And so it's about that, the positioning what we give the languages within our society. It relates to that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And then our final bit before our discussion, just quickly, I know I've touched on this, but why is translanguaging anti-racist, right? So let's just finally make it sure it's clear for everyone. And I have these 3 favorite quotes from 3 scholars that I used a lot in my research, right? So again, the most foundational piece for us is that Kendi says to be anti-racist is to intentionally break those hierarchies, right? Which means that we can't be neutral. There is no such thing as not racist, right? So no education is politically neutral from bell hooks, right? Excuse me. So there's no such thing as being neutral. Silence and inaction means keeping racist hierarchies in our schools, which harms learners, right? And then from Flores and his work, which Betsy just, just talked about Flores a little bit, but saying that translanguaging is a way to break that neutrality, to be intentionally anti-racist in our classrooms, which actively breaks down that hierarchy of English compared to other languages. Therefore, translanguaging is not a neutral practice, right? That's how we disrupt racism. And so it's up to us every day to choose, how do we disrupt these hierarchies? Where do we see these hierarchies in our classroom? And then finally, I love this quote by Bettina Love: "It is who you must be in and out of outside the classroom." This is a journey. It's not easy, right? Anti-racism is not easy. But to get to racial justice, we have to keep trying, and it has to be who we are, so that we can better serve our learners and work towards racial justice.
So now you're going to have a chance to talk to others in our first breakout room. From what you've heard so far, how is translanguaging different from what you learned about teaching English as an additional language? Maybe in your teacher preparation courses and from workshops you've gone to, and how do you already make space for other languages in your classroom? And how do you think how do you see translanguaging as an anti-racist practice? We're going to give you 8 minutes, and it's really critical that you use your time well. Make sure you choose a timekeeper within your group, have a facilitator to make sure everybody has a chance to contribute, and please keep in mind those commitments that Cydnee shared with you at the beginning, and then be ready to report one inspiration from your discussion out to the whole group. We'll use the chat for that when you come back. All right, so you have 8 minutes, and again, here are the questions. Penny put them in the chat for you as well, if you want to make sure you have those handy or take a picture of the screen.
Great, I'll go ahead and put you into groups.
And if you feel like leading, you can either message us or just come off and say, I'm willing. I see Jenna Rose knows the word for snow in Somali. Thank you, JR. Anyone willing, or should I have Betsy do French for us or another language? Betsy, would you count for us? You're on mute, Betsy.
You're on mute.
What stretch would you like to do?
First, so you can either stand up or sit down, everyone, but let's just stretch to the side. All right, so you can just put your hands here, and then we'll stretch to one side. And
okay, ready?
Just have Betsy count.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Did you all have a great stretch? And in your class, we won't have time, but you can then practice, have everybody repeat the numbers as well as you go through the stretches as a group. That felt really good, Cydnee.
I know. I need some yoga.
Yeah.
And then as learners get used to some of the exercises, then they get to pick which stretch to do, right? So giving them even more ownership. But then it's really fun learning the numbers in other languages. All right, so for our next example, we have a word wall. I know some teachers like to keep posters, or maybe those, I can't think of the hanging signs that you can put index cards into.
Pouches, yeah.
Pouch, yeah. Key vocabulary from their current unit, right? So you can extend this to include the words from other languages. So the example I have on the screen is apple, and then I have apple listed in other languages, right? So then But a key part of this is not just you doing the research and putting it out there, right? You're asking the learners, what word would they use for apples? Have them write it for you if they know how to spell it in their language and write it. Give quick pronunciation lessons for the class and for you. If you don't have the space for this, you can encourage them to write their translation, in their notebook or on their worksheet, right? That way it's a resource for them to come back to look at, make connections with words, right? Which helps them learn. If they don't know how to write it, you can look it up together, right? Lots of different choices that you could do. And for the higher level classes, you can have more in-depth conversations like the example earlier, right? There's nuances to different words. I know someone put that Inuit has like 50 words for snow, right? So they could decide which one fits this story the best, right? Having that deeper conversation, having those persuasion skills in there for learners, right? One thing I do want to note that I do often hear students say though, teacher, I'm here to learn English. So that might be something that you also hear. And I just want to say it's important to have these explicit conversations with them about why incorporating other languages really helps them learn English, or explaining why it's just fun to learn about others. And your whole class isn't going to be half, or at least it depends. I know there's so many different kinds of schools, but I don't speak Somali, right? So my whole class can't be in half in Somali, but those little places that I can put Somali in there is helping out, right? And then the next example, very similar to the word wall, but I wanted to put this in here because, like I said, I work with pre-literate students. And so I use a lot of pictures, right? So I incorporate pictures in my classes daily. I would have this picture with a, for our vocabulary unit, maybe it would be representing shopping. And that's a great way to really, for people who come from oral cultures, to really focus on having pictures, getting them to talk. What do you see in this picture with the vocabulary that they know, right? But then I wouldn't only just stop at shopping, right? You could ask them, what else do you see? They can name the fruit. You could have more conversations about what is apple in your language, what is bread in your language, and just an excellent way to get them talking and then bringing their culture into, right? Same thing, you could have deeper conversations, still do this with higher levels, right? And then same thing, they may say, teacher, I want to learn English. You know, that's something for you to figure out with your students, where the line is of introducing the other languages. Okay, so for our next bucket, we have writing. And the first example is brainstorming and journaling. Excuse me. So anytime learners are doing brainstorming or journaling as part of writing activities, you can encourage them to start with other languages if they so choose, right? Up to them. To help them gather their thoughts first. This can really help them get their ideas flowing so they don't have to worry about how to say it in English. If you know their home language also, then it's a great way to gauge what skills they have in their other languages. You know, so you're understanding what assets they have in each language and not only looking at their deficits that they have in English, that they don't have that persuasion skill yet in English, right? If you don't speak their languages, then you can also see how much are they writing, right? And then have them turn that final product into English, but it is a really great way to get them thinking. And then I'll turn it over to Betsy.
Yes, so many of us are using project-based learning, and we know that this is a rigorous and it can be a demanding approach to teaching, where we want learners to really access a variety of materials, both print, digital, oral, like listening, videos. And so one of the best ways to do that is to encourage learners to access materials that are at the level of their intellectual and their content knowledge abilities in their own language, because they might be beyond their ability to do it in English. Okay, so if I think about what I can read and write in English versus what I can read and write in French, my ability to access rich content in English is much higher. So as Cydnee just alluded to, and it's a question that we had here too in the chat. This doesn't mean that the learners are going to create the final product in that home language, though. The idea is, remember, leveraging the first language as a resource, leveraging it as a tool, so that then they can build their content knowledge, build their understandings, and then work collaboratively to create their projects in English ultimately. So these colleagues of mine, Van Dyke and Januaria, they did a study about the benefits of using translanguaging. If you can go to the next slide. Her students, they did projects on what do you do, for example, what do you do if you're pulled over by the police? What if you're in a car accident? What if you're approached by an immigration officer? And they were really blown away by the level of complexity that their level 2 students were able to work and produce in their presentations. They created poster presentations. They did a gallery walk in their school. So these are just a couple of examples of their level 2 self-advocacy presentations. You can learn more about the work they've done. You'll have their list on our list of resources. If you take a look at California TESOL and the TESOL, California TESOL publications, you can learn more about what they've done. Another way that we can encourage translanguaging to build content knowledge is to give learners opportunities to work on class assignments in their first language as needed first, and to get prepared then to produce that same complex task in English. Right now, I have a student in our master's program who's a science teacher, a high school science teacher, and she's been looking at how about having learners do their science reports, sort of that classic, fairly complex high school assignment in the science classroom. How can having them do their science reports first as in Spanish or Mandarin or whatever language, how does that help them then write it in English? Now, she is thinking of maybe doing this as a formal study, but so far the results are super promising. She said that the students have a deeper understanding. They're able to express themselves more clearly. So they're really using their first language and sort of a rehearsal of the task in their first language as a dry run and as a support for doing it in English afterwards. I think you can move on to the next slide.
Thank you. And our final writing idea is to put learners in same language groups when you can, when they're doing writing activities. And so I've been teaching now for 4.5 years, I guess. And even 4.5 years ago, I was hearing a lot of language in teacher education that split learners up who speak the same language so that they're not only speaking to each other in Somali, for an example, right? But this is this research is really pushing that idea of putting learners together so that they can help each other throughout their doing their activities, and it can be really beneficial, right? They can have those deeper conversations about maybe differences and similarities that they're seeing of the language patterns of this is what it looks like in Spanish, but this is how we would do this in English, and really help each other that way. And you'll see in our resources that there's an article by Ofelia García, and she has some really good examples of how a teacher uses the language groups and how beneficial it was in their classroom, right? And then next we have reading. This one's shorter, only a couple of quick examples for reading. First is just to think about how can you build your classroom library with books from languages in your class's full list of languages, encouraging learners to read in English, but then also to read in other languages, and they're building reading skills, academic skills in any of their languages, right? It's also, though, showing how you're then showing them how important their culture stories are also. One example, kind of like Betsy was talking about earlier, but then they start with this book in Somali or Spanish or Arabic, but then give a book report finally in English, right? So how can they use their skills to then give this kind of assignment, right? Otherwise, you're also just showing that their culture is important too, right? Do note that this is more difficult in other languages. And of course, a lot, like I said, my Somali women wouldn't be able to read a book in Somali. But you can have conversations with learners about why is it easier to get Spanish books and not Somali books, as an example, right? But I do think we have these conversations with our learners, and just it's not you making all these decisions on your own. You're having conversations, you're sharing that agency in the classroom and figuring out how do you want that classroom environment for each other, right? And then again, the language groups, same thing as before. When you're doing reading activity, comprehension activities, right? Having them in language groups, figuring out words together is a great tool. And then we've got a few additional thoughts. This is our final little section before we'll turn it over to y'all to do some more discussion. I know we've thrown a lot of ideas out there today. So we're almost there, right? But one of the questions I get asked the most is, what do I do if there's only one learner who speaks a certain language? So Betsy will walk you through a couple ideas.
We've had that question in the chat a few times today already. So one of the things, again, think of this as really elevating and valuing all languages equally, and having conversations with your learners about the benefits that their first language brings to the language classroom, regardless of whether this is their first, second, third, fourth, or fifth language. So you can give them some strategies, some ideas. For example, well, use your home language for note-taking while you're listening or reading to something in the target language. Because sometimes you can't keep up with note-taking in English, right? Now, you might think, well, of course they could do that. Of course they would do that. Sure, and maybe you've been encouraging that, but it's being really intentional about, sort of allowing students the space to do that. Never really giving the impression that this is an English-only classroom and you have to do everything in English. Provide them with multilingual resources, just like Cydnee talked about with books in the first language. It could be dictionaries, other resources. Repeat and review content in their home language while they're studying. These are, so it doesn't matter if you have one speaker or many speakers. These are just tips and strategies that you could encourage them to use. Brainstorm for assignments in their home language. Do drafting, as I already mentioned, in their home language. So again, it doesn't matter if you don't speak their language. It's not for you, it's for them, right? Ask them, well, do you think in your home language while you're listening or speaking in the target language? That's a normal kind of bridge that you're making to acquiring an additional language. So these are practices that all learners can apply on their own and employ on their own, whether they're the only speaker in the room or one of many speakers in the room.
And I just want to add that there's not one size fits all, right? It's you figure out what works best for your classroom. Most of the ideas that obviously Betsy just said, and then the ones we said earlier, do work with only one student. I know the language groups is the key one that okay, you can't do that as much, but I encourage you to think out of the box. And what if you have one Spanish speaker and one Arabic speaker? Can you put them together and maybe change their discussion question a little bit of maybe they're not helping each other figure out, okay, this is what the language pattern looks like in Arabic, but they can talk together of okay, how do we form this sentence in English? Oh, that's so interesting. Spanish does this, Arabic does this, and they're still sharing. It's just a little bit different, right? So there are ways that we can think about how can you leverage that if there are at least a couple of other one language only people in your classroom.
Right. And another question, people often ask me is, well, so are you thinking of a classroom that's, now as much in other languages as in English? Not necessarily. No, it's a lot about a mindset, isn't it? Don't you think? And really, again, about valuing, and as somebody said here in the chat, students don't always see their first language as an asset. And so really helping to reshape and reframe that notion, right? And that, becoming multilingual is an asset. It's something to be celebrated, to be encouraged, right?
And exactly. And having explicit conversations with learners about why it is an asset, because from personal experience, I can tell you, I see every day why I'm told that my grandparents speaking more like African-American vernacular is not an asset, right? That I had to learn how to speak more educated than them. So showing them that you value all of their assets, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. All right.
And then, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say one other last idea was how are you using dictionaries and translators in your classroom, right? Really building those study skills that they can look words up in English, can they look words up in French, in Arabic, right? And this is something that one or many students could do together, of really trying to figure out, okay, how to use that. Also the digital literacy skills, right? Of using an online translator, for an example, right? And kind of last thought is I also want to push everyone to believe in themselves. It's kind of that mindset of, though I don't speak Somali, I can tell when students are being persuasive with each other, when one student is explaining something else to another, though I do not know what they're saying, right? So we can then still think about, okay, I can tell that they're still genuinely on task. I can tell when my Somali women are not on task, right? Encouraging us to also kind of think a little bit more, trust our own skills.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so in fact, Cydnee, that's a question that teachers often ask me when they sort of had that mindset that using the L1 was a big problem. And I said, but you, again, use it as a gauge as to whether or not your tasks are unclear, too complex. You haven't given clear instructions. You haven't modeled yet. Right. You, and like you said, you and I've been out observing classes for years, and I was just observing a class quite recently on Zoom with one of our adult ed teachers. And, you know, it's, you could watch as the students were sitting down with others and assisting them. It was so apparent. Yeah. We will know. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
And last one, promise. Also just thinking about how could you change things around the schools? Having interpreters more regularly, could you use advanced learners or maybe people who have graduated from your program already as interpreters? Can you set up formal paid internships for them? And this maybe is 2 years down the road, you have to find funding. Let's not worry about all the barriers yet. But my point is, how can we see the language use learners building more leadership skills within your classroom, right? All of your school info, intake forms, community messages on like a bulletin board, are those in other languages? And then finally, having building relationships with community leaders so that they give talks and presentations, whether they're in English or maybe they come in and give a presentation in Somali, right? But figuring out how that would work for your school.
So we're going to do another breakout room, and we're gonna have it a little bit shorter than what we have on our facilitation slide. Let's do 6 minutes and think about one translanguaging activity you already do use. You probably said, oh, I do that. I didn't know that's what it was called. Or what are, and then what are, you know, 1 to 3, depending on how much time you have, 1 to 3 things from today's session that you're committed to trying in your classroom. And then come back again with any questions you still have, and we'll have a little bit of time for some Q&A to wrap up. So you can go ahead and place people to your, I peeked into your amazing Jamboard. And so the nice thing about Jamboard is that now we don't have to take the time to do the formal report outs, because you all have the Jamboard and you have all these wonderful inspirations that you've all shared here with one another. I hope that you use Jamboard in a similar way in your own classes. Imagine too how you could use the for doing some translanguaging activities with vocabulary, for example. So we're going to end, if you'd like, it's really impressive. It's really exciting. We'd love to give you some time for questions with us, and you can feel free to open up your mic or use the chat function, but we still have a few minutes left for questions and or inspirations. And we have good wait time, so.
So mine is more of a colleague thing. I teach GED, but I'm closely associated with ELL in another program that's adjacent to my town. And there they really don't like the idea of translanguaging, because they were taught, no, we don't allow any extra language supplementation. So do you have any tips for, you know, this is really the way it is evolving and needs to be, and this is the newest thing?
Right. Yes.
When it flies in the face of, you know, everything we've done for 25, 30 years.
Do you want to start, Cydnee?
Yeah.
Or do you want me to? Go ahead.
I can. I mean, there are lots of resources out there of, the data research of why this is beneficial to learners. If you're looking at it from, and I know a lot of people need to be convinced with data, right? But once you show them that, there's also that human perspective of it. And, I'm really glad you asked that, because I say this and don't want y'all to think that it's easy to do all this. We do have a lot of control of what happens in our classroom, but I've worked at a school where we had an English only policy. And so it's about that journey of having conversations with colleagues. This might take years to do, but trying to get that policy changed and really trying to figure out, why is translanguaging good? Why do we need this in terms of racial justice? But it's not a simple answer, but hopefully over time we can get there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there will be more and more studies, and we can, Cydnee, you and I, we can put together a list of some of the studies that are out there that's beyond the list of resources that we shared. And I think there will be more and more research done. And we've got several students who've done translanguaging projects at Hamline, kind of looking into the research, doing things like classroom-based practices to share with mainstream teachers. But we have this one current student, and I suspect that she may very well do a study. It'll be really great to see, and we'll keep you posted on those resources. Again, it's sort of a mindset thing too, Carol, just helping, really helping people to think of this along with everything else that we've been exploring over the last couple of years, where the events of the last few years have really elevated the need to be addressing head on the racism that's so present in this society. So this is just one of many efforts. Other questions? We still have a few minutes for another, we have about 5 minutes.
And real quick, I just want to say, these are the resources. You have them in the PDF of the slides, right? And the hyperlinks are there. So you do have access to what we talked about today. Can I quickly answer Danielle's question in the chat? My capstone is available at the Hamline Library, but also stay tuned to Atlas's website, because I did a pilot study. My whole project was a 10-hour study circle that lasted over 5 weeks on this topic. So, pared down 75 from 10 hours to 75 minutes. But we're going to figure out how to put the whole study circle on Atlas's website. So you could take it, hopefully do future versions with Atlas, or take it, the facilitator's guide, and do your own kind of self-study with your colleagues.
I see several Hamline students here today, and you'll have access through the Hamline Digital Commons, and I just need to check to make sure that's public access. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it is. If you go to Bush Library, the main page of Bush Library at Hamline University, okay, then go to the Digital Commons, you'll have a link to student theses and student projects, and you'll be able to find it there. I'll just. Thank you, Patsy. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh, well, the higher level, I mean, I think the project that I shared from California, the teachers were working with level 2, but then also a very advanced level class. And then actually, as I recall, they did a series of lessons explaining the benefits of translanguaging. So they kind of taught it as a content-based unit in sociolinguistics. Actually, it's the best way to describe it. They did short readings. They had learners explore the role that their languages play in their lives. And so it became kind of a topic of conversation within their very advanced level class. And then they did a study of the changes in their attitudes about their first language use in language learning. So there too, I can check to see if that was published in CATESL Journal as a study. But it was with very advanced students. And then they did the same project, the project-based learning units on critical issues in their lives and self-advocacy. And their poster presentations were even, more complex, but they were also really encouraged to employ those practices of delving into the research in their own languages and really, using all of those supports to be able to create something that was really robust in their final products.
And to add, if you do your own little search into translanguaging, right, you'll see that most of the resources are K-12.
Yes,
And so that was part of my gap for my master's was that where's the information about adult learners? And so that one Garcia article we have in the resource slide is with adult learners, but a lot of it, you might have to look at K-12 stuff with higher levels and then figure out how to move it to adults.
Yes. I mean, that's because so much of it is in an attempt to reframe kind of old paradigms about bilingualism and deficit, sort of deficit-based views of bilingualism and views toward English learners in the content areas. So the work in translanguaging in the K-12 world has been going on for, quite a long time, actually. It's not new, but yeah. Absolutely. I meant to mention that earlier too, Cydnee, when you said something that it's definitely not something that's been explored a lot in adult ESL, nor is it talked about as much in higher ed, to be truthful, because it's not as much of a sort of a critical issue in terms of whose languages are we talking about? If you're, let's say you're a master's student or a PhD student who's an international student coming to learn English at a university, this is sort of a non-issue. You're not, there's not a lot at stake if you're not gonna risk losing your home language. You're gonna go back home in a year, right? It's really an issue that we talk a lot about in English dominant countries and in particular in the K-12 world, but we need to be talking about it beyond that.
Well, I see we're at 3:45, so I just want to do a final thank you everyone for coming and listening and participating.
Yeah, special thanks to Betsy and Cydnee for putting this together, and to our sign language interpreters, and to Penny for her work behind the scenes.